If you follow the news closely, the German Chancellor recently made a short visit to the White House. In addition to the trade policy, the relationship between US and Germany at this moment, of course, one of the crucial topics was brought up, and by both sides, is about the war in Ukraine. Now, during the conversation, this is what the German Chancellor said to sitting US President, and
we have to talk about Ukraine. There are too many bad guys in this world, actually, and this is an issue we have to talk about because we all want to see this war coming to an end as soon as possible.
Well, more than almost 4 years and the war in Ukraine continues, and some believe that Russia is about to lose the war, but others believe quite the opposite. Ukraine is losing the war, and it's time for Ukraine to make any type of compromise. Well, how about the reaction from the Ukrainian side? And what about the effort under the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky? How can we understand the future of the war? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Michael Desch. Professor Desch is a Packey JD Professor of International Relations at the University of Notre Dame and the founding Brian and Jeannelle Brady Family Director of the O'Brien Notre Dame International Security Center. Well, Professor Desch, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Pleased to be here.
Well, again, sir, it's such an honor to have you on our program. As I mentioned before, initially when I discovered you, because of this amazing article that you wrote, which is entitled, Ukraine is Losing the War, with Moscow Pressing Its Advantage, Kyiv Should Trade Land for Peace. Now, Professor Desch, as I mentioned in the intro, not only the German Chancellor, but also the international leaders continue to press the urgency to end the war in Ukraine. Not only we're seeing this devastation on both sides, and also we talk about, the resources and also the supplies. But in the article, let's talk about what you wrote. This is what you wrote, and I quote, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is pushing back, refusing to do anything that would violate his country's territorial integrity, yet the realities of the battlefield are not on his side. Professor Desch, from your perspective, what is your analysis at this moment regarding the war in Ukraine, and why do you think the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky continued to push back regarding the territorial dispute? Your thoughts?
Well, those are two important but somewhat different questions, Will, so I'll answer them sequentially. I mean, the reason the Ukrainians are back on their heels at this point comes down to two big things in my judgment. One is the raw balance of power. Russia is a much bigger, better developed country with larger military capability. There's the old saw about God favoring the big battalions. Russia has the big battalions. And the demographic trends for the two sides and their militaries are not looking good. The Ukrainian population is shrinking. Ukraine, in order to maintain, its military, has had to start relying on conscription. And conscription is not popular in Ukraine. And so that puts them, in my judgment, at a disadvantage to the Russians, who have a conscript military, but they don't use it for the special military operation. The 700,000 troops that the Russians have on the line of combat contact are contract soldiers. They're volunteers. I think there's war weariness on both sides. No doubt about that. The Russians have the advantage not only in numbers, but also if you've got somebody who signs a contract they're more likely to be willing to execute that contract than somebody that gets pulled off the street in Lvov, stuffed in a van, given a week of training, and then sent to the front lines. So, in a nutshell, that's why I think things have changed. So we could talk a little bit about the impact of drones on the changing nature of warfare on both sides, but leave that down the road. Second thing is, why is President Zelensky reluctant to trade land for peace? And I think, there are a couple of things. One is, he's a believer, and he's got a lot of people in Europe and even in the United States who are telling him he's in the right, that Ukrainian sovereignty extends to the 1991 borders, and he shouldn't settle for anything less. I think there are also people in Ukraine, people with guns and who are willing to use violence, who feel very strongly on ideological grounds. Although I'd note that, we don't have good public opinion survey data in Ukraine because it's been under martial law since 2022, and polling in an environment like that is fraught at best. But the Kiev Institute of Sociology published a recent poll for the end of last year suggesting 72% of Ukrainians would accept, under certain conditions, the front lines where they are, which means Russia has about de facto 20% of the country. The big debate, of course, is the Russian demand that, in addition to that, the Ukrainians evacuate the rest of Donbass, including the so-called fortress cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And I make an argument in the piece that, I don't think the Russian army has been making huge gains, but they've been making steady, small gains that I think put them achieving by force of arms domination of the rest of Ukrainian-controlled Donbass, within a year and a half or so. And so, another year and a half of war is going to cost a lot of money, and more importantly, a lot of lives on both sides. And if the outcome is inevitable, why not bite the bullet, no pun intended, and do it? But it's interesting, President Zelensky, and I think like many wartime leaders, their great strengths are their great weaknesses. So in 2022, President Zelensky was quite courageous in standing up in the face of a Russian invasion that a lot of people thought would, be over very quickly. I had a lot of fortitude, but the dark side of fortitude is stubbornness. And he's stubborn on this issue of not surrendering territory. And the reason I raised that is there was a very interesting contretemps between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, who's the Ukrainian ambassador to Great Britain, but was until recently the top commander of the Ukrainian army, about the strategy for the big Ukrainian offensive in June of 2023. And to summarize it in a nutshell, what Zaluzhny and what his Western advisors were recommending was a narrow, focused assault to drive to the Sea of Azov and basically isolate Crimea. But what Zelensky wanted to do was continue the what had been a successful assault against the Russians in late 2022 across the entire front. But the problem was by 2023, the Russians had dug in, and they had also made some tactical and strategic innovations that meant that it was a whole new ballgame. And that's been the disconnect between Ukrainian strategic objectives and their capabilities. I think it explains a lot of the mess they're in today.
Professor, let's talk about another concept. Of course, really appreciate your in-depth analysis regarding the current situation and also the reaction, should we say, the strong reaction or the determination from President Zelensky. Now, again, I want to go back to the article. Based on the current circumstances that Ukraine and Russia are still deadlocked in this war, but when we talk about another term, it's compromise peace. I think this is something that it's mind-boggling for the international community. We understand the word compromise. We understand the word peace. But at this moment, again, we're looking at the war in Ukraine, and also we're looking at what we say the war between U.S. and Iran, any other conflicts around the world. I think when it comes to the word compromise, excuse me?
And Ecuador this morning.
And there you go. So again, Professor, from your perspective, especially we look at the complication of the war, how would you define the word compromise? I think it's more than a word negotiation. It's more than just bring the two sides, sit down at a table, start to work out the details or start to work out the conditions. I think at this moment, there are political reasons, and so there are cultural, of course, there are economic reasons. So again, Professor, from your perspective, what does that mean that the current circumstances to push Ukraine towards a compromise peace? And why do you think that both sides, especially from the Russian perspective, it's not that effective? Or in other words, we're seeing less willingness to reach compromise. What do you say to that?
Do we have 3 hours to talk about that? I mean, that's a excellent, meta question, but one that is very complicated and needs a lot of unpacking. I mean, it's really the complexity of that concept is, sort of the root of the problem, why I wrote the piece. And why we're talking about it today, and will be unfortunately talking about it for a while. I think the problem is that, again, to go back to President Zelensky and the Ukrainians, is they think that they have the moral high ground, and they believe it on the basis of the norm of sovereignty and the fact that Ukraine is, or at least at one time, was, a democracy of a sort. So from their perspective, why would we compromise those things? My point is that, look, you may be right, but you could be dead right. And I'm a realist, and I believe that at some point facts on the ground need to, ultimately carry the day. I also think, by the way, and this is too long to get into, but I think that there's an element of modern just war theory that we don't talk about enough, reasonable prospect of success. And according to that, a war is no longer just if you can't achieve the objectives you're fighting for. So, I mean, I do think there's also a moral argument on the other side. I also think that we in the West tend to see Ukraine and Russia like an old Western movie in black and white. The Ukrainians are wearing the white hats. The Russians, and especially Vladimir Putin, are wearing the black hats. I see this conflict, and I see the history that led up to it in shades of gray. And couple of things. I mean, John Mearsheimer is absolutely right. The deep cause of the Ukraine war was NATO expansion. I followed NATO expansion both here and in Russia in the 90s. I saw the effect that it had on Russians, even very liberal Russians. And, you know, I understand that. Why did we expand NATO? Very complicated question. There were a lot of liberal Russians, including Yeltsin's foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, who, by the way, is in exile in Florida now, who said that NATO expansion was going to bring to power the most hardline anti-Western politicians you can imagine. He told me this in a meeting with Sam Huntington in 96. 1999, the first three new members of NATO came in, who'd previously been in the Warsaw Treaty Organization. It's the same year that an obscure bureaucrat from St. Petersburg stepped on the national stage. Okay. Secondly, fast forward to 2014. We portray the Maidan uprising as, you know, sort of the popular will in action. And we say that the Donbass war that began in response was all Russian little green men. That's nonsense. You know, at the time, observers who were following the situation or looking at it closely understood what Sam Huntington had said in the Clash of Civilizations a decade before, that Ukraine was a civilizationally divided country, with Ukrainians in the West being very Western oriented, and that the Ukrainians in the East, who overwhelmingly spoke Russian, and who, when they could vote in democratic elections, voted for politicians who supported a neutralist or a softly pro-Russian policy. The so-called anti-terrorism operation, the Ukrainian military operation to suppress the Donbass uprising, it's not a genocide. That was Russian propaganda, but it was brutal. And in fact, it's no accident that when the Russians in February 2022 launched their invasion of Ukraine, they called it the special military operation. And so again, you know, the Ukrainians, you know, flip side of their view of international sovereignty was their view that the Russians couldn't tell them how to manage political opposition within their country. And okay, but then don't tell me, especially when you wage war against part of your population in a brutal way, that you've got the complete moral high ground. We don't accept that argument in other civil wars. Why should we accept it in this case? And so, you know, let's you know, think about this, you know, from the Russian side. You know, the Russians, beginning with Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet period, had been very accommodating. Now, they had an increasingly bad hand to play, so they didn't have much choice, but they, especially the people around Gorbachev and then around President Yeltsin, really believed that with the end of the Cold War, there could be a new security architecture in Europe and Russia could be part of it. These people were Western-oriented liberals. NATO expansion was basically saying to them that we're going to expand this Cold War alliance, which, by the way, includes the power during the Second World War that was responsible for killing, directly or indirectly, about 30 million people, as part and parcel of that. Now we say, it's a defensive alliance. It's made up of democracies. Don't worry about this. That's not an argument we would have accepted if we were Russians, and they didn't. Nonetheless, even Putin was not initially as uncompromising as he has become on this issue. For example, after 9/11, he was very supportive of the United States in its global war on terrorism. Now, part of that was self-interested because Russia was fighting Islamic movements in Dagestan and especially in Chechnya. But nonetheless, he played nice. Also, he wasn't, and many other Russian nationalists weren't happy with the Baltic states joining NATO, which they did in 2003. But he lived with it. But what he said, as it became clear that any compromise on his side was not going to be met with compromise on the West, at the famous Munich Wehrkreis, the security conference in Munich in 2007, was that he laid out their bill of goods. And it was from the Russian perspective, and you can challenge parts of it. You can question its motives in part, but he didn't say anything ultimately that wasn't true. And at Bucharest in 2008, we said Georgia and Ukraine, two integral parts not of the Warsaw Pact, but of the former Soviet Union, were eligible for membership in NATO. And we have the war in Georgia right after that. The Maidan uprising in 2014 was about the strategic, or at least political, orientation of Ukraine, and how much it represented popular will, and how much of the street protests and riots and political violence were manipulated or not. I mean, historians will continue to debate, but this was not that that Zelensky ran in 2013 and won on the policies he's got today. It was the overthrow of a democratically elected pro-Russian or Russian-leaning president, and an extra constitutional replacement of him by another more pro-Western politician. So I think if you tell the story in its full complexity, it may not justify the Russian invasion in 2022, but it does portray the larger picture in tones of gray rather than black and white.
Well, again, Professor Desch, I wish we can have 3 hours to go into much deeper regarding the questions and also the discussions. Now, I want to wrap up our conversation by inviting another crucial leader into our talk, who is the current French President Emmanuel Macron. Now, recently, Emmanuel Macron made strong statement regarding the war in Ukraine, and of course we know that President Macron has been one of the strong advocates in terms of supporting Ukraine and also criticizing Russia. Now, this is what he said recently, and I quote, "As all the allies, we have to be the one to negotiate this new architecture of security for Europe the day after, because our geography would not change. We will live with Russia at the same place and the Europeans at the same place. I don't want this negotiation to be organized by anyone else," end quote. Again, take the words out of the context that President Macron was referring to, hopefully that should be a negotiation, or there should be a type of, again, borrow the word compromise between Russia and Ukraine. But meanwhile, when we listen to the voices from the European side, or even the NATO allies, Professor Desch, I want to ask you the final question is, how do we measure the effectiveness of the voices from the European side at this moment? Because clearly, as we briefly touch on, the U.S. involved in another war at this moment. And the European or NATO allies and European countries really need to step up and really need to do more to help Ukraine. But how about the effectiveness of the voices? At this moment, how do we understand that? And also, how do we measure that? Your final thoughts.
Well, Will, once again, you've posed a very fundamental and, at least in my mind, a very complex issue. There was a famous book by a defense intellectual guy who was at Rand and then in the Reagan administration in the Pentagon, Freddie Clay, entitled "Every War Must End." And I think this war must end too. Now, by must end, there were two elements of it. There is the moral element, but there's also the practical element. Neither Ukraine nor Russia can fight this forever. My judgment is that Russia can go on a little bit longer, but the war is imposing a toll on Russia as well. Okay, so it has to end, and the question then is, what do you do in the post-war period? I think for Macron, and I think he's channeling sort of French Gaullist tendencies. He understands, and maybe he's even, a little bit pleased by the fact that Europe is going to be less dominated by the United States in the post Ukraine war environment. And so I think part of what he's saying is we Europeans have to get our act together, because we haven't had our act together.
That's right.
And that's been, true through the Cold War period. The dominant position of the United States has, led the rest of the Europeans to just sort of sit back and go for the ride. I think, so I'm sure that is part of it. I think a second part of it is the realization that Russia, like Napoleon's France after the Napoleonic Wars, isn't going anywhere. It's going to be a big power, and it's got to be part of the post-Ukraine European security environment, broadly defined. And this is a function of narrow interest. The Europeans are going to need Russian fossil fuels again. They're barely able to, pretend like they're not, burning Russian gas now. But my God, what's going to happen if the Iran war goes on for too long is that, already, if you're looking for an investment, the Gazprom shares are going up. And so, that's sort of the narrow interest. But, and maybe I'm just projecting my own hopes for the triumph of a realpolitik view of future European security, a la Castlereagh and Metternich, that we think about Russia not in the way we did at the end of the Cold War. They lost, we won. They can live with anything we decide to do, but rather thinking about a way to reintegrate them into a security architecture that produces a more stable Eurasian situation than we've had certainly since 2022. But if you buy my argument, since 2008.
Well, I mean, again, Professor Desch, it's one thing that we continue to talk about the war in Ukraine, but in the reality that both sides, especially the citizens and also the international citizens, and we bear no more because we're seeing the casualties and also we're seeing the devastation on the daily basis. So we hope and we do pray that this war will eventually come to the end, regardless who's going to be the mediator. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Michael Desch. Again, Professor Desch, it's a professor of international relations at the University of Notre Dame. And we thank you and really appreciate the insights and analysis from Professor Desch. And I strongly encourage everyone to check out this amazing article, which is entitled, Ukraine is Losing the War, with Moscow pressing its advantage. Kiev should trade land for peace. Well, Professor Desch, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show. And hopefully next time when we have the conversation, we're going to see something good, or at least some good news about the war in Ukraine. So thank you so much for doing this.